Welcome back to another video, and today we're going to talk about events and functions. So now, let's say you create your health to be an integer. So it doesn't really matter too much because you can always convert between one another. You can always go back and forward. So if we would select one of the variables and drag that into the event graph and release, it gives us two options. We can either get that value that's set in that variable, or we can set that value. For level, let's just get that value. And now let's drag in our health as well, and let's set that value. What we can do is simply drag from this thing right here and bring it into our health. As you can see, this created this converter, and if you hover over it, it says converts an integer to a float. So this works just perfectly. The issue is when it goes the other way around, when it comes from the float to the integer, then you need to use a different node. So we can again drag from the float value. So this is the value. So the output, green output, is the value. And here we need to look for a node called truncate. So we have the truncate. So we truncate, and this basically rounds so this value that we pass along, this rounds towards 0, truncating the fractional part. And as you can see in the example, it says if it's minus 1.6, then it becomes 1. If it's 1.6, then it becomes 1. So it always goes towards the 0 value. Another option would be we can again drag from our float value, and we can then look for a round. So this will make a little bit more sense probably. So in this case, if it's a round, then if it's 1.6, it's going to become 2. So it's going to go to the closest full number, just like we do in the math when we round things up. Now, this is some very basic information about variables. Now let's talk a little bit about what are functions and events. Let's start with events. So first, we have a bunch of them by default in our character. We have the input access turn rates, lookup rates, we have the turns, lookups, jumps, input touch. What else we have here? We have the move forward, move right. So this is basically move forward and backwards. This is move left and right. And this is input reset VR, so virtual reality. So all of these red things are essentially events, and we can have launch events on keyboard keys. So if we would right click and let's say we want to have like keyboard, let's say I, then we have the keyboard I. So here we have the possibilities that we might have. For some reason it didn't round it up close enough, but here we can select the keyboard I, and you can see it's red, and it allows us to do actions on pressed, and it allows us actions on released. And let's say I want to add 5 health to my character every time I click the keyboard key I. So let's drag in our health. Let's set the value because we want to set the value, and let's connect the white route. Like I said, that's the white route is the road that we are going to go through, and at this point if we click I, we're gonna set our health to be 0. As you can see, it says 0. So now let's say I want to add 5 health. So what we obviously want to do is get the current health that we have so that we can add 5 to that. So let's drag again our health into the event graph. Let's get this value because we want to know what is the current value. Then we can drag from the float value itself, and let's look for a plus. And we want to add float plus float because, well, our health is a float value, so we want to add a float to a float. And then we can set what kind of a value we want to add. So let's say I want to add 5. And then we can plug this output value into the health, and now this is going to, every time once we click I, it's going to get our health and add +5 to it, and then set it to be our new health. Now to actually see the result, because we don't have anything that will actually display the health, what we can do is again from the white route we can do a print string. And so basically we are just going to print a text in the screen. And it's very simple to do that with a float. We can just simply drag the green into the pink, and this instantly creates a converter from a float to a string, and now this is going to display a number on our screens. So now if we press play, and once I press I, at the top left you can see it says 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and it goes all the time +5. So that's how basic events would work. Now let's talk about function. To add a new function, same as for variables, you can go to the Functions tab and create a new function. Let's give this a name, add stat. Let's call this add stat. Now the function is essentially the same thing as an event. There is some kind of an action that is happening, but the difference between a function and an event is that function can give you an answer about what was the result, while event can't. Event doesn't have like the output route, while our functions do. So let's say we have this add stat thing, and we probably could have like two things we could add. Let's say we have the health. So let's drag in the health. Let's set the value. And let's add another new variable, and let's call this mana. So we're going to have health and mana. Let's make this into a float, and I want to categorize my variable in the stats. So what I will simply do is drag this and drop this on top of stats, and now this is categorized with the stats. So let's drag in our mana as well. Let's set that value. And now let's create some kind of a functionality which will basically decide what kind of value we actually want to set. So this is the beginning of the function. This is always going to be your beginning, and from the white route I'm going to do a if branch check. So depending on the condition, if it's true or if it's false, we're going to set one of these values. So the true is going to go to the health, and the false is going to go to the mana. Now to set these values, I'm going to do exactly the same thing as I did previously. I will drag in the health, get its value, do a float plus a float, so plus. There we go, and I'm going to add 5 to the health, like this. I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the mana, get mana, do a plus, type in 5, and connect that to my mana. Now, the next thing is we need to actually provide a value for the condition. By default, you can see it's set to true because it's checked. If we uncheck this, then this is false. Checked is true, unchecked is false. But, well, I want to set this to be a dynamic value so that it can be different every time. So I'm going to click on this beginning node, and here on the details panel we have the inputs. So let's add a new parameter for the inputs, and let's call this input. And so I'm going to leave it be as a boolean because I need a boolean. I need true or false, and I can just now connect this input into the condition like so. Now I also want to do an output. So what I will do is again click on this input node, and I will add an output. So let's add an output. It instantly creates as a return node. This is basically the return. We can now click on the return or the add, and it gives us the same, essentially the same panel over here. So in the outputs, I'm just gonna call this value, and I'm gonna make this into a float because I want to return my health or my mana. So let's bring the return value down, return node down. Let's connect our white route, so the road that we are driving down. So now over here I want to plug in the health into the value so that it would return my health. And again from the mana, let's drag from the road, and let's just look for a return node, and it's going to create us another return node. We can have as many of these as we want, and in this one let's connect our mana to this so that we would print out, well, not print out but return our mana. So now we can compile and save this, and this is our function. We are adding one of the two stats. So now let's go back to the event graph. Let's delete this thing, and I want to have another keyboard event. So let's go this. So this is going to be the keyboard. Let's select O, keyboard O event. There we go. And now since we created a function inside of this blueprint, then this function is available in this blueprint. So we can right click and look for add stats. Actually it's called add stat. So we have the call function add stat, and as you can see it looks like this now. So it has again the execution, so we can connect that to the pressed, and I'm just gonna Control C, Control V to copy this like so. Now let's talk about some basic stuff. So first, it has some inputs. Well, in the function we just created one input, which was I called it input, but here we have two of those. We have a target and we have an input. The target is always the location where this function is located in. In this case, it is in the third person character. We are in the third person character, so the reference is going to be a self-reference, because, well, the function is living in this specific actor. Now for I want to do so that I would add health. So to add health, I need the condition to be true. So this input then needs to be set to true. And now every time I click I, it's going to add 5 health. And every time when I click O, it's going to add 5 mana since the value is false. Now to print out the values on the screen, again from the white route, I'm going to do a print string, and I'm going to print out the output value. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to print, and I'm going to print out the mana value in this case. So let's do that. Let's compile and save this. Let's press play. And now every time we press I, we have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Exactly the same thing that happened with a regular event. Now on O, again, 5, 10, 15, 20. That's our mana. Again, I, 75, 80, mana on O, 25, 30. So that is how a basic function will work. What is a really cool part? Well, two cool parts about functions is that we can reuse them. As you can see right now, we are using the same function to add our health and mana. And also, since we can output these values, we can basically bring those values to the next function or to some kind of another actor, or we can check some conditions, whether something is actually true or false, and it takes less space for us in our main event graph. Now, one more thing to keep in mind of is that in the functions, we can't really have time things, so you can't really pause the action in the middle of it, so you can't have like a pause in the middle of the function kind of. There are ways around it how you could do that, but generally there isn't a way, because the functions themselves don't really support any time-based actions, while our event graph does, because in our event graph, if we right click and look for a delay, we can add a delay node, which basically gives like a pause for some kind of an action, and then, well, once the delay is over after this specific amount of time, it continues with the tasks it's supposed to. So this is the very basic information about functions and variables. Hope you found this useful. Hope I did a good job at explaining this. I find this topic very complicated to explain because I was very young when I first learned this, and I learned this on my own. I didn't have a teacher who would explain this stuff for me. One cool resource I could give to you is this website right here. So the website is called v3schools.com. This is a really cool resource. I used this when I was learning how to make websites. And over here you can learn quite a few languages. You can do some stuff about websites, JavaScript, some server-side PHP stuff, and also you can learn C++, which is getting used in Unreal Engine 4. So I strongly actually suggest you have a look at this page because this contains a lot of the information about what are variables more in depth. Don't really pay too much attention to the examples themselves because this is the actual code that is getting created. Obviously, if you are interested, you can try it on your own. You can modify it a little bit and it's going to give you the output depending on what kind of a code you basically put in there. It's going to talk about all kinds of data types, operators, so those are like plus, minus, equals things right here. These things also are used in Unreal Engine as well in the node system. It has all the Boolean stuffs, conditions, switches, loops, breaks, arrays, all this stuff. So this is actually a really cool resource to look at. So that's going to be it for today's video. Hope this was helpful, and I see you in the next one.